Happy to share Dr. Austin Perlmutter with you. He has spent a good part of his career in the last few years looking at the deleterious effects of air pollution on our health. It's a big deal. He's going to share it here. Well, Dr. Perlmutter, great to see you. Always a pleasure. Really happy to have you here talking about a really important matter. So welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so we all hear about it, right? We hear about air pollution being a thing. In the 70s, you'd see the pictures of, smog in LA and say, oh, well, it's not that bad. But we also didn't understand the magnitude of how bad it really is and what the long-term implications are. And I know you've been deep in the research on this. Air pollution's a big deal, but let's now understand why.
Yeah, you're absolutely right in that this is something that's been around for a long time. People have known about it for a long time. It's actually been hundreds of years that people have recognized that it has a health issue, and really thousands of years of documented history of air pollution in human societies. But I would say the reality of this, and the most important thing for people to understand, is this isn't just about prevention of conditions. It's about feeling better today. The quality of the air that we breathe has a direct and profound influence on every aspect of our wellness. And so, why that's so great is that almost nobody is taking just basic steps to enhance their air quality. And when you do, you think better, you feel better, you might lose weight, and you're just going to overall have a higher quality of life. So I think that's a really empowering place to start. But it is true, as you alluded to, that this is a big deal. And what gets me about this is we have spent so much time thinking about exercise and diet, things like sleep and how they impact our health. And all of those things are important. But 20,000 times a day, you are bringing in about a liter or so worth of air. And that air is filled with quadrillions of molecules. And the quality of those molecules you bring in is so much more than just the relative contribution of oxygen and nitrogen and trace gases, because that air has the opportunity to make you a healthy, happy person, or the opportunity to bring you down, to sap your energy, to drain your metabolic and immune health to the ground. So, yes, I'm excited about this. And the main reason I'm excited is because I think this is the most powerful, unrealized opportunity that we have for health that nobody is talking about.
I love it. The idea that, oh, well, I don't live in Detroit, the air's
Mhm.
pretty good here, quickly gets dispelled with this understanding that indoor air pollution is five, some people say up to six times worse than outdoor air pollution. And the things that we put in our house outgas. And that to me, that was a terrifying moment for me going, uh-oh, what have I locked myself in here with? And so I don't think any of us are safe because of the manufacturing and the world that we live in. So let's talk about how ubiquitous it is, because I think if you live in the country, you think I'm fine, but there's, a farm with pesticides down the road. Like it's everywhere.
It is true. And I want to caution us because I think it's easy to go down the route of saying this is terrifying and there's nothing I can do about it. And the exact opposite is true. This is a domain in which we have so much say. But let's go to what you just described. It is the case that if you live in the United States, by and large, outdoor air pollution has improved over the last 100 years. Now, a qualifier to that is that over the last decade or so, we've seen a reversal of improved air quality in the Western states because of the recent wildfire seasons that we've had. And anybody who lives anywhere near the West Coast, in addition to more recently the Midwest and New York, recognizes that when wildfires are out and the air turns basically orange, that isn't a good thing for our health. But what you've spoken to, which I think is probably more important for most people to realize, is that the majority of air pollution exposure that the average person experiences is happening inside their home. And it's coming from the things that they are not aware of. It's coming from all of these hidden sources of air pollution that we're buying in the stores, that we're generating within our homes. So if we're looking at the direct impact on our health from the quality of the air that we're breathing, I think for just about everyone, the important focal point of this conversation is to clean up the quality of the air in your home. Yes, it makes sense, to pay attention to what's coming in through your windows. Yeah, you probably shouldn't be outside going for a marathon jog when the air pollution is terrible from the wildfire. But what you really should be paying attention to today is what's happening inside the four walls of your home and your office and your car.
So, what are the big culprits? There's so many that you hear of. What are the ones where we're seeing the worst health outcome, the worst downstream health issues?
Right. So when we look at air pollution, different countries around the world and different groups kind of focus on different air pollutants. And there are many different types of air pollutants, but the big ones that are worth paying attention to, probably let's start with the biggest one. It's called particulate matter. And conveniently, particulate matter is named based on what it is. It's tiny little particles that float around in the air. And so particulate matter is grouped based on the size of the particles. So larger ones are 10 microns or larger, slightly smaller might be around 5 microns. And then, really, where these get to be very concerning for human health is at the range of 2.5 microns or smaller. And the reason for this is because depending on the size of these particulate matter that are floating around in the air, it will kind of define where it goes in our respiratory tract and whether it can get into our bloodstream, in addition to how long it stays floating suspended in the air. So larger particles tend to fall out of the air quicker. They're heavier. They can't float around as far. But the smaller the particles, so especially these PM 2.5s or smaller, they might hang out in the atmosphere for weeks and potentially even months, cross thousands of miles in the air. And most importantly, when we inhale these PM 2.5s or even smaller molecules, they actually can get into our bloodstream and can directly induce inflammation in our bodies. So that is, I would say, if you're going to know one type of air pollution, the best one to be aware of is these particulate matters, these tiny little particles, and specifically the PM 2.5s or smaller that have been most consistently linked to worse cardiovascular health, to diabetes, to obesity, to neurological diseases like dementia and depression. So that's the first one. The other ones I'll just briefly mention. We can dive into them in a little bit more detail. So there are certain types of gases, nitric oxide, sulfur dioxide, that have been linked to a range of negative health outcomes. And then there are these volatile organic compounds. These have names like benzene and toluene. These are known carcinogens. So this is well established. But what people don't understand about these volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, is I think they are some of the most egregious contributors to indoor air pollution that people don't smell. They don't detect. Where are they coming from? They're coming from those spray Febrezes. They're coming from the scented candles. They're coming from our cook stoves. So these are things that are really subtle in the atmosphere. And yes, they're contributing to the nice smell that you have from that thing that you're putting up on your table for the pumpkin spice for the October season. But the reality is, we're now understanding that these VOCs, these volatile organic compounds being released by our scented products, are actually major contributors to indoor air pollution and may themselves have a number of toxic effects on our health. So I'd say, again, there are certain types of gases, as I said, nitric oxide, sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide. All of these are well established kind of air pollutants. We also have the particulate matter and then the VOCs. There are other ones that we can get into a little bit more if you like. For example, ozone is a well established kind of air pollution metric. There's some interesting thoughts there because a lot of air purifiers create ozone, which kind of defeats the purpose of an indoor air purifier if you're creating more air pollution. But I'd say those are the big ones to be aware of.
So, for the lay audience, where does the filtration happen slash not happen? I mean, most people think, well, my lungs are supposed to stop that. So at what point is 2.5 microns just too small and gets right through the mesh? And then at that point, are we talking like a gut barrier, like the endothelial cells of a gut barrier where we have tight junctions? Like, let's just look at the anatomy. Like, what's the gate they're breaking through in the lungs?
Right. So if you were to kind of trace what air does, we would imagine the air goes through our upper respiratory tract, through our nose, ideally, or through our mouths, if for whatever reason we're not able to be good nose breathers. And it kind of goes into our bronchi and then our bronchioles, and then goes into all these smaller and smaller channels until it reaches our alveoli, which are our lung cells. And at this point, you do get something kind of similar to what we might think about in the gut, which is that certain things are small enough to kind of sneak through. Now, in the gut, we know that there is a permeability issue. So certain people may have issues with the tight junctions in their gut. We know this is linked to an increased risk for exposure to food and other antigens, microbe antigens that can get into our bloodstream and may cause disease. In the lungs, the problem here seems to be not that we necessarily get a leaky lung lining, but rather some of these particles are just so small that they're able to go directly through these alveoli. They're able to kind of bypass all of our amazing natural abilities to clear this. And so bigger particulates, PM5s, PM10s, can get stuck in the cilia, which are kind of these little hairs in our respiratory tract that can help kick them back out again, which is great. But these really small ones, so the PM2.5s and these ultrafine particles, can sneak by. And that's really an issue because what it means is if you're inhaling these particles, your body isn't capable of defending against them. And that's why when you look at the research around PM 2.5 exposure and markers like inflammation, we see that there's a pretty tight correlation because they can get into our bloodstream, they can reach our various organs, they can amp up the immune response. And that really wouldn't be happening if our upper respiratory tract was able to clear them out because it wouldn't be able to activate kind of systemic immunity.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And so, where are we seeing the fallout? You have these tiny particles getting in, and you're saying they're creating inflammation. Where do they like to go? Do they end up going to opportune areas? Like, what are the symptoms versus like clinically? What are we seeing?
Yeah, I think what is a little bit less clear is whether it's the particles themselves or kind of the outcome of those particles. So let me give you an example. One of the areas that I've spent a lot of time focusing on is what are the environmental factors that are influencing our brain function? So our moment to moment thought process, our mental health, our risk for depression, dementia in general. And something that was really compelling when I learned it is that around 15% of the cells in our brain, so billions and billions of cells in our brain, are actually immune cells. They're called microglia. These immune cells have a very important and specific task, and it is to respond to information from the outside world and kind of in doing so, program our neurons to ideally a state of better health, better adaptive function. Now, the problem is that when we take in the wrong types of signals, when it tells our microglial cells, hey, there's danger in the outside world, our microglial cells get activated and they actually produce inflammation in our brains. And so when you look at the brains of people who have lived in places with high levels of air pollution, in particular, there's research that's done in Mexico City, you see evidence of an increased elevation or an elevation in these microglial cells as far as their activity. So the idea here is that this is a response to the PM 2.5s in the environment, that when a person is exposed to high levels of PM 2.5s for a longer period of time, it actually activates these microglial cells, leading to higher rates of depression and risk for dementia. Recently, we found out the Lancet said that air pollution was actually one of the primary drivers of Alzheimer's risk. So that's really important stuff. The nuance as to how do these pollutants actually penetrate into individual organs and activate something like the immune response is a little bit less clear. But it may be the case, actually, it's probably the case that some degree of inflammatory activation is a direct response to cells like microglial cells in the brain, just as an example, binding these PM 2.5s to their receptors, which then leads to a cascade of immune activation. So to kind of make that long story a little bit shorter, there are a number of pathways by which these PMs and other air pollutants are probably activating metabolic dysfunction, inflammation, and other negative pathways in our body. One pathway is by directly binding to immune cells and other cells and kind of cascading into some of these negative outputs.
There's been a fair amount of work in the last decade or two about some like the PFAS and some of these substances coming in, some of them that have been labeled obesogens, and the toxins having to be stored inside of fat cells or inside of bone in order to protect us from them. Um, are the microglial cells wrapping them to protect them in our understanding of it? Like, well, like, is it just that these our body doesn't know how to detoxify these, so that we got to do something to get them out of traffic?
So there's an interesting question as to how do various signaling pathways kind of activate cells and what does it do in cells? One of the kind of core pathways of the immune system and macrophages, of which microglia are really a subtype, is that they phagocytize or they eat up pieces of damaged cells and other debris in our bodies. And by doing so, they help to protect other cells from exposure to things that could be damaging. They help to clean up, for example, the brain. If a neuron dies, they will actually eat up the pieces of that neuron, digest it so it's not there creating problems. The PMs are pretty small. So it isn't as though it is, a bacteria that needs to be eaten up and broken down. It's very small. We're talking about kind of these tiny little molecules. As to what happens with these molecules, I do think it's relevant to say there are the conventional air pollutants. So again, the PMs, the gases, the VOCs, and then there are a group of molecules that are called obesogens. And these tend to be a little bit more kind of complex molecules. An example would be bisphenol A, which people may be familiar with because it's found in, or has been found historically in a lot of plastic. Um, Phthalates and other molecules that are used in the production of plastic. And some of these can become aerosolized. And so when that happens, we can inhale them, they can get into our bodies, and they can kind of they tend to change hormonal programming, and in doing so may induce obesity. But these, I would say, it's not the same thing, I guess, as imagining what happens when a cell kind of eats something and stores it inside. I think what is perhaps more interesting that might be happening is that when these molecules bind to certain cells, they can actually activate programming, transcriptional programming within those cells that then leads to a cascading effect that is long term going to be propagating the danger signal that came in the first place. It is true that certain chemicals from our environment do tend to bioaccumulate specifically in fat cells. And it's one of the reasons why it can be a bit challenging for a person who's losing a lot of weight and doing it in an unsupervised way, because you could be liberating some of these environmental toxins that build up in fat cells. And some of those may be among those that we discuss as it relates to air pollutants. But really, what we're talking about here is kind of this cascading effect of signaling that seems to lead to some of these long term health impacts, and a little bit less the point of you're storing these things and therefore you're just building up a toxic load, even though that's part of the conversation.
So it triggers the signaling, but is there a way for the body to actually move these tiny molecules out? Or do we know what happens to them once they've bound and done the thing?
Yeah, well, I mean, our body has amazing detoxification pathways. We can discuss how that happens, but one of the ways that you can actually test for certain air pollutants is you look at the urine levels of these molecules, and the reason they show up in the urine is because our bodies were able to kind of tag them and remove them through our kidneys, so they wind up in the urine. So if that's the case, then we could assume that, our bodies are capable of mobilizing and removing these molecules. And I think what's really important to understand is that most of the research on the negative effects of these molecules, this exposure, is talking about long-term sustained exposure. There is some data, which is kind of interesting and a bit concerning, that even short bursts of exposure to air pollution can cause issues with, for example, cognition. However, for most people and most of the time, the research would say it's about long-term exposure. And why that's important is your body is actually excreting and getting rid of these chemicals from air. That is happening in the background. There are certain things that we may be able to do to promote it. There's also other things we can do to mitigate some of the kind of pathways activated by air pollution. There's some interesting work around, for example, breastfeeding or eating certain dietary patterns to offset it. But I think the thing for people to know of is that, yes, it's important to know you can detox, that you can remove these. But the main thing is to stop getting the exposure. You can liken this to what happens in diet, and people will say, oh, well, I'm going to do a 3-day juice cleanse, and then I'm going to go right back to eating the standard American diet. That is not a good solution. It's great to know that your body is able to reset itself, turn over cells, get rid of the junk you put into it. But people need to be aware that the real solution here is to decrease our exposure in the first place, in addition to helping to get rid of some of these toxins and mitigating them with other strategies.
So before we get into decreasing exposure, which seems like the obvious front line, you mentioned metabolic health as one of the kind of downstream issues that we're seeing as well. How are we seeing that translate? Like, what are we seeing in patients? What are they coming in with? What are the symptoms? And what are you guys finding?
Big picture, people need to know that if you're an average person as far as your health, you probably have at least one marker of metabolic dysfunction. A recent study came out from the University of North Carolina. It showed that around 90% of people have at least one marker of metabolic dysfunction. So that could be elevated blood pressure, elevated uric acid, obesity. But the bottom line to all of this is the knowledge that most people are metabolically unhealthy. And that's really important to know because poor metabolic health correlates with worse mental, cognitive health, cardiovascular health, higher risk of death, higher risk of cancer. It is a big, big problem. So then we would ask, what are the things that are negatively influencing our metabolic health? And most people tend to go to the basics. It's diet, it's exercise, but it turns out that air pollution is a big factor in this too. Part of this stems from what we've just discussed, which is the idea that air pollution can act as obesogens, that it can activate pathways within our cells that can lead to the promotion of weight gain. But we know inflammation increases metabolic dysfunction as well. So, bottom line here is to understand metabolic dysfunction, really important for everyone to know about, and the air pollution is actually a major driver of metabolic dysfunction.
So what are the smoking guns, the gases? You'd mentioned the VOCs, the particular, like what are the things inside the house that we need to become much more aware of?
Right. And this is where I think it gets really practical, really interesting, and hopefully it bothers people just a little bit because I think there has been this kind of systemic plan which has been designed to get us to associate some of the least healthy products with things like purity and greenness and health. So, what am I talking about here? Well, it is certainly the case that if you have something in your home that is smoking, that you're generating air pollution. And I don't want to sugarcoat it. If you're creating smoke, you're creating PM 2.5s. It's as simple as that. So, if you are cooking over your stove and you're, heating things at a very high heat and you're generating smoke from the food, that is air pollution. If you're lighting a candle, if you're lighting incense, if you're lighting any sort of let's see, uh, whatever it may be, if it's generating smoke, and even to some extent, essential oil diffusers, all of these things, if it's generating kind of a mist, a smoke, that is a source of air pollution. We can talk about the relative utility of thinking through essential oil diffusers. They're not necessarily as risky as something that generates smoke, but realize that if you're creating a mist, if you're creating a scent, if you're creating any sort of kind of aerosolized product, that is a high risk for air pollution. Now, beyond that, I would say there's some nuance. We could talk about certain types of candles. We could talk about certain types of essential oil diffusers, but something that nobody should be using is these aerosolized sprays. And I'll just mention a brand here, Febreze. That is a direct and toxic air pollutant that you're putting into your environment. So it's not necessarily the PMs in this cases, but it's the VOCs and a whole host of other chemicals that you're aerosolizing and therefore breathing in. Really, what I would tell people is if you go into the grocery store, if you go into even the hardware store or the pharmacy, that aisle where you have these air fresheners is basically the most concentrated source of air pollutants that nobody is talking about. So whether it's the dangly tree that goes into the back of your rearview mirror or the sprays that you spray around your house because your kids smell bad, or the little plugins, the Glade or Febreze plugins that basically put these nice scents out into your environment. These are all direct causes of increased air pollution in our homes. So why that's great is, in my opinion, these are all amazingly easy things that we can do to dramatically enhance the indoor air in our homes, in our cars, in our offices. Just stop using these products. There's so much research around basically the fact that these are some of the top contributors to indoor air pollution. One last thing I'll say on that is going back to what I said originally, which is you don't want things that smoke in your house. Obviously, if you're a smoker, that's a big deal. If you're a secondhand smoke exposure, that's not great either. But scent is another big variable. So if you're smelling a product, hate to say this, but if you're smelling, that aerosolized spray, or you're selling or smelling that nice potpourri, you're actually smelling VOCs. Not all of them are necessarily bad for you. Not all of them are toxic. But there's a product that I've been thinking about a lot that is kind of a combination of both of the things we don't want. One of those things is the smoke, the PM 2.5s. The other is the VOCs, and in particular, VOCs that are sourced from chemicals that are known to be bad for us and largely come from petroleum. And what I'm talking about here is scented candles. You know, I think all of us have had been in a place where you walk in and it just smacks you in the face. The intensity of that apple spice candle or that pumpkin spice candle or the ocean spray or whatever. The reality of it is you're smelling air pollution. Your nose, your brain is just basically picking up these pollutants. And so when you combo that with the smoke that is generated from these candles, I think scented candles are actually one of the worst offenders as it relates to indoor air pollutants.
Yeah, it's a big deal because they're on sale at TJ Maxx every day. It's like they're so easy and there's so many of them out there. I would have patients that would go into a hotel lobby and have a headache for a week. I would, a guy with Italian cologne would get into an elevator with them and they'd be sick for 3 weeks. And so you have these really sensitive patients as well. What are we seeing with people who are just overwhelmed by the stench? Is it just detox pathways backed up? Is it something else?
So interesting because I'm one of those people, my partner's one of those people. And when I was in early training, I remember seeing some of these people who come and say, I can't be in the clinic if there are scents. It has to be an unscented clinic. And I think that a lot of conventional medicine just kind of looks at this as, oh, it's just a sensitive person, or, maybe they're just unique or whatever. It's not a big deal. But really, what it is your brain telling you that you're being exposed to danger. That's the reality of it, because these scents that we're inhaling are dangerous, not only to our bodies, but to our brains. So it is probably some combination of early life experiences and genetic predisposition, but it is actually a substantial portion of the population that experiences things like headache and nausea, dizziness, lightheadedness when they are exposed to some of these potent smells. And Pedram, I know you've been in these hotels. We've been traveling, we've been doing talks and all these things. You'll step into the lobby or you'll step into the elevator and it just smacks you this intense aroma that they put in there to try to make it smell appealing. A lot of people are sensitive to that. And it's a good thing that we're sensitive to it. It's like your body's spidey sense saying, hey, this isn't good. This is not something that is doing my body any favors. So I think we're going to see, if we haven't already seen, this transformation, which is going from saying, oh, some people are just, inconvenienced because they are sensitive smellers, to recognizing that these are some super taster equivalents. These are people whose brains and bodies are set up to be more aware of some of these toxins. And really, you kind of want those people to be hanging out with you because they're going to be the ones who are telling you, hey, there's something funky going on here, and we probably shouldn't spend too much time in this area.
100%. I've been a canary for a while, but before I realized I was a canary, this is a segue into a piece that I want to bring up with you, is I would get angry. Like my wife would drag me to the mall and we'd go through the fragrance section and I'd be like, I got to get out of here. And I literally would start to get agitated. And because I was a monk, I would kind of reflect back and be like, what the hell is this? Like, why am I suddenly so upset? And then I realized I had these chemical sensitivities. But you had mentioned in our show notes before we started violent behavior. And I see it. I see it. Like literally, I could feel it coming up in me when my system felt like it was under attack. And so it's fascinating that this is part of the literature now.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't some sort of a fringe theory. When you look at large scale data in the United States, and the way they do this is they map satellite levels of air pollution against basically crimes. What you find is that people not only commit more crimes when they're exposed to higher levels of environmental air pollution, but they commit more violent crimes. That's really just the tip of the iceberg. We know that children tend to behave differently when they're exposed to more air pollution. And so, what we're saying here is that there is this potent effect of these molecules on our brain state in real time, that based on the levels of exposure to air pollutants in our environment, we are more or less likely to think clearly and to behave in ways that could be incredibly detrimental, not just in our own lives, but to the stability and the quality of our society. I mean, this is a much bigger conversation, I think, because I presented on this a few times and it feels really important. Look, we are in a place, in a time in the world in which there are some, I would argue, really terrible decisions being made. And there's a lot of politics and all the other things, but I think we could agree that if we were going to look at the most likely uh, variables that would lead to humanity, in essence, being wiped out or not doing well. So, nuclear war, climate change, these are reflections of human decision making. What are we prioritizing? Are we prioritizing ourselves, the me, the moment? Are we prioritizing something a little bit bigger than ourselves, which might be our family? Are we looking at community? Are we looking at the environment, the bigger picture? And it can be mapped against anything you want, Maslow's hierarchy. But the truth of it is, if we want a shot at survival as a species, we have to be capable of making decisions that carry empathy, not just for ourselves, but for each other, for the planet. And one of the principal variables, I believe, that determines whether we act in a way that is better for more than just ourselves, or whether we act in a way that benefits the me now and leads to a higher risk of destruction of this planet, is the brain's inflammatory state, is whether inflammation is active in our brains. So I don't think it's just about, oh, higher rates of depression, higher rates of dementia with higher levels of air pollution. That is true. And that is enough, I believe, that all of us should be taking steps to decrease air pollution exposure. But from an existential perspective, as we're looking at patterns of decision making, we have to look at what are the variables programming our collective brains towards either a state of empathy or a me first, impulsive, and violent, kind of aggressive, polarized, uh, and really what I'm talking about here is the me first mentality that is going to increase our odds of not surviving as a species. So yes, as a short answer to your question, violent behavior correlates with air pollution exposure. But the bigger picture here that we're talking about is that if we're looking at the long term survivability of humans on this planet, these variables actually matter a whole lot more than just what's happening in our own homes.
It's interesting the juxtaposition of the me first. If you think of the no pun intended oxygen mask on first in a plane crash, you have to take care of yourself so you can take care of others. And I see this all the time with people. I mean, some it's called vitality. It's about stoking that kind of intrinsic ability of the body to heal and feel better and all of the things that we would take for granted until health is gone. But I see this with patients routinely. They start taking care of themselves. They start making better decisions. Then they start noticing how everyone else is so spun out and whacked out on all this stuff. And you're like, oh man, there are neurotoxins in their brains. There are poisons in their blood. Of course they're behaving that way. And there are a lot of implications about how we judge that and how we look at that, whether it's a pathology that can be treated with just lifestyle, right? And so, first thing I think of is I don't care how many green smoothies you're eating, drinking, whatever creams you're putting on. If you're putting those scented candles in your house, you're on a hamster wheel, right? So let's talk about strategies to offset this because you got to stop the bleeding, right? You can't keep taking punches in the ring.
Yeah, and again, this is not complicated stuff, which I really love because I've been on the stand talking about, when I say the stand, I mean up at the conference pulpit, talking about you got to start exercising, you got to start eating healthier, get rid of the junk food, go to the gym. Those are things that people may or may not want to do, and they may or may not enjoy. The good thing about air pollution is that the strategies necessary to dramatically decrease our exposure don't really require a whole lot from you. They're not necessarily unpleasant. So, at a base level, there are two things that a person can do to help basically decrease their exposure. One is to generate less air pollution in their home, and the other one is to remove more air pollution in their home. Like if we're looking at the physics equation here, it's really not all that complicated. So, how do you generate less? Well, certainly if you live somewhere that's polluted, you don't want to be opening your windows and allowing all that wildfire smoke inside. For most people, that's not the case. For most people in the United States, I should say, unless it's wildfire season or you happen to live really near a freeway or an industrial plant, you're probably better served having the windows open. But you can go to air quality websites and basically find out, is the air quality outside good? And if so, you should basically have your windows open if you can, based on the temperature and so on and so forth. A lot of the strategies that you can use to decrease the exposure to air pollution in your home, we've kind of already gone over. It is important to understand that one of the top contributors to indoor air pollution is cooking. That's across the world. It's much worse if you're using solid fuel for cooking. So if you are living inside of a house, you probably shouldn't use charcoal. Now, in many places around the world, these aren't options. It's kind of the only thing you can use is biofuel for your cooking. Um, but if you are somewhere that you can use something besides that, you should. And as we're looking at things that you can do beyond that, it does seem to be the case, and I know there's controversy around this, that gas stoves do contribute higher levels of air pollutants than electric stoves and induction cooktops. So, again, there's nuance to this. A lot of people have gas stoves, they're not trying to get rid of them, but you should be aware that if you cook on a gas stove, that ventilation is key. And so, if you have a gas stove, use a hood. If you have a gas stove, open the windows when you cook. If you have a gas stove, maybe be more cautious and don't cook things on super high heat that are generating additional smoke. It's also been noted that people who have gas stoves are actually releasing some of that gas into their environment, even when the gas stove is off. So, if you do have a gas stove, it may be worthwhile getting it tested, getting it checked to make sure that you don't have a leak. The reason for this is that gas stoves, specifically the gas, the methane, primarily gas that is used for gas stoves, can often increase exposure to VOCs and some of these other air pollutants as a reflection of reactions that happen in the local environment. So electric is slightly better, and induction might be the best. It's expensive, but those are some basic ideas around cooking. For other stuff, it is realizing that anything that you're aerosolizing is most likely a source of air pollution. So if it smells and it's chemical, that is probably a source of air pollution. Cleaning supplies, as we've said, scented candles, even your essential oil diffuser. Now, I hate to say this because people say, oh, well, that is healthy. Yeah, but not exactly. When you look at studies showing air pollution from essential oil diffusers, it actually dramatically increases the air pollution in a localized environment. There's probably something to be said for if you're going to use one, make sure you're using basically not tap water, because tap water actually contains a number of chemicals that can be aerosolized. So using filtered water may be a good idea, and trying to get essential oils that are not coming from kind of chemical synthesis. Um, then again, as I've already mentioned, kind of cleaning supplies, I think, are really big. So uh, it's a tough one because we all want to use cleaning supplies, but don't use the ones that you have to spray and that have a strong smell. In general, I think is a good idea. I'm a big fan more of using vinegar than I would some sort of a chemical cleaning supply. There are some that are better than others. We don't probably want to go through that whole list with specific brands. Um, and then other things I would say, you touched on this one already, is the off gassing component of what happens in our environment. So, certain products that we bring into our homes, because of the way that they are created, actually release air pollution into our localized environment. And this can happen for months, for years, depending on what you bring into your home. There are certifications you can look for. Specifically, it's the VOCs that I've mentioned that are the off gas we want to worry about. And so there are various certifications you can look at for furniture, for carpets, for other things that you bring into your home to decrease the amount of VOC exposure. But certain chemicals, for example, paint and other kind of household chemicals, those are sources of off gas that we really should not be having in our homes. So if you're painting your house, if you've got open chemicals, make sure you store those in the garage. And then when it comes to other sources of off gas, furniture and the like, I think the ones to look out for would be any sort of composite wood products. Carpets are definitely one. And then furniture in general. One of the strategies I think is really practical is if you can buy secondhand furniture, it's a great way to decrease the off gassing because it's already done most of that off gassing. So that I think covers the primary spectrum of things you can do to reduce the amount of generated air pollution. The other half of that is kind of how do you remove it once it's there? But I'll pause there for a second and see if all that makes sense.
Yeah, before we get to the removal, because there's strategies, right? One of the things that blew my mind looking into this story in particular was the amount of flame retardant chemicals that are put on everything that has plastic in it because it's gonna catch fire. And I guess a bunch of hippies were falling asleep with lit cigarettes in the 70s, passed legislation because you don't want houses burning down. And now even the fire departments are saying we don't want this flame retardant. I mean, firemen are dying of cancer trying to put out these fires. And so there's flame retardants. Obviously, the forever chemicals, made the news. They may or may not be a challenge with the lungs as much, but they're in the water and all that. Um, and you just got to watch the inputs, right? If it's made in a lab, if it's a chemical, that's the problem. Is we've been trained to put our guard down and just trust that if something's for sale at Target, it's got to be fine, right? And Febreze is for sale at Target. They all are, right? And so this, I mean, to me, it's a really important point. Is again, we're not. Listen, there's a lot of clean stuff you could change out in your supply chain. If you're listening to this right now, and the problems go away, right? Get it out of your house. Don't freak out, but you're the one buying it, so let's be careful.
I think that's right. Yeah. I mean, I wish that there was a straightforward thing you could say, which is shop only at this store, or only buy furniture that comes from, your friend, your neighbors, whatever. The truth of it is life is complicated. If you're really looking out for your health, it's a dynamic process. You can go to Whole Foods and stock up on a ton of junk. That is absolutely true. Just like you can go to Safeway and buy a whole bunch of wonderful organic produce. The reality is that we have to be the ones taking the agency, because the modern world has almost no interest in us being healthy. I mean, that is just not the way that commercialization of the modern world has been set up. And so, to the point that you made, which I really appreciate, it's that you can go to your neighborhood grocery store, drugstore, hardware store, and find things on the shelf that we know are going to dramatically decrease your quality of life and your health. And there's no warning. There's no information there that people would say you really shouldn't do this. I mean, there's so many different versions of Febreze. There's the Glade plug-it-ins. These things are not good for anyone, and I've used them in the past because I fell victim to this idea that these were nice things, that they make you smell, make your place smell nice. The little. I love that little dangly Christmas tree in the back of the rearview mirror that creates a nice smell in the car. We've all been in a taxi and the Uber where that's been used. People don't know this stuff. And I think that the problem is that we are in a society in which there's very little incentive for any large scale organization to educate on these things. Now, always with toxins, always we're talking about things that are in our environment that could be poisons, whether it's food or air or water or other things around us. It can be very easy to slip into this place of kind of helplessness, saying, there's nothing I can do. Things are just so deadly, so dangerous. I'm just going to have to deal with it. But I think the exact opposite is true, because every day that you're going out and finding something that you're bringing into your home, you get to ask a couple of questions. Do I need to be worried about this, or is it pretty high quality? And if you ask those questions, I think it's actually pretty straightforward to dramatically mitigate this. And it can be so simple. Just stop with the scented candles. That could be your win of the week, your win of the month, to help protect you and your family. It could be as straightforward as that. So totally appreciate what you're saying, Pedram, as far as, you've got to take agency over this stuff. The setup in the modern day is just not one in which you can afford to kind of defer to the prevailing norms.
I hope you're enjoying this interview. I want to remind you the Summit Upgrade Package is for you to upgrade during this event. If not, it's double the price. Look at what's in there. It's an absolute no-brainer. If you haven't upgraded already, please do so. No, no. And the attention economy wants you to be asleep and just move forward and buy this thing, the next thing they told you to buy. And then you'll be a consumer of the healthcare system. It's not great. Yeah. Yeah. And so, all right. So then the answer, people are listening going, all right, so what air filter do I get? I mean, is it that simple? Right. And there's a lot of these things I've heard. I'm very curious what your research has brought up.
Yeah, I do strongly believe that air purification systems work and should be something that are democratized, made available, especially in places like schools where it's been shown that, air quality may be a bigger issue even than at home. So, to that end, the reality of it is air purification systems are not very scientifically advanced. And I think that's really important, because if you go online and you're looking at air purifiers or looking at, anything you can do to clean your air, you're going to see 8,000 different special scientific advances. And this gets me back to what I said before. So, if you buy an air purifier with an ionizer, you're creating ozone. Ozone is an air pollutant. Doesn't make any sense. The UV light, same thing. So really what an air purifier is it's a fan that pulls air through a filter. There's kind of two stages to this filter. There's the basically the carbon filter that should be bringing out some of the VOCs, and there's the HEPA filter that takes out some of the PMs. And it's as straightforward as that. You pull the air through the filters, it takes out the air pollution. Um, it's important to note that the potency of your air filtration or air purifier system is a function of um, how much air are you able to pull through the filter and what is the quality of said filter. Again, these are not complicated equations, but there's a lot of kind of marketing speak out there that'll confuse you with something or another to teach you, well, what you really need is this ultra plasma ionized UV special thing that's going to get rid of everything. So, to that end, I would say if you're able to get an air filtration system or an air purifier, I should say, your real goal here is to get one with a HEPA filter and ideally something like a HEPA 13 filter, which is one of the better HEPA filters. And you want to make sure that the amount of air it filters is or purifies is roughly this lines up with the size of the room or the space that you're trying to clean. You need to replace the filters. Some of them have replaceable filters. Most of them do not, in order for them to remain functional. So that's the standalone air purifier. And then the other piece of this is if you have kind of an HVAC or if you have a home filtration system, here they use something called MERV, and it's basically just another way to talk about what is the quality of the filter. To what extent does it pull particulate matter out of the air? And so generally speaking, a higher MERV is better than a lower MERV. And again, you're in this position where if you're using it the right way, you're going to be replacing it. And I will tell you, we have, these air filters here. When we pull them out, they get pretty dirty. So it is very clear that they are working. Um, I know there are a lot of other things that people could talk about here. Plants always come up, say, oh, well, if I just buy a bunch of snake plants, that's going to clean up my house, right? I love plants. My partner, Rachel, she loves plants. We have a lot of plants in our house. They do not significantly reduce air pollution. They look nice. They bring us a whole lot of psychological benefits, but that is not an alternative to having these devices that are able to suck in air and push it through these air filters.
I really appreciate you saying that because the one word you didn't drop in the marketing speak was quantum, right? Oh, this has some sort of quantum thing on it, which magically resolves all your problems, and it's part of the marketing speak. I think people also do that with plants and nature. It's like, well, the plants, the wisdom of nature is going to clear this thing. I had a buddy who looked at the NASA plant. NASA looked at a bunch of plants, put them in orbit, and yes, they had some effect, but nothing close to a MERV filter or a HEPA filter or the things that we actually need to pump the air through and scrub it out. There is one thing that I learned doing a story on this a couple years ago that kind of blew my mind, and I just want to make sure our audience hears this. Was the guy who was doing the design of all these said that no, well, you have to have your HVAC on at all times because modern homes are built in a way that has negative suction. So it's just assumed that the lungs of the house are constantly breathing. And so I'm like, well, I should open my windows. He's like, your house was built 4 years ago. The entire design of the house with the negative pressure means you need to run the HVAC to have the air cycle through, and which I hate. I mean, I'm not a sleep under the AC kind of guy, but you might want to check with when your house was built and how it was built. Some of these homes are designed to constantly have the HVAC on, and they will not filter through the lungs of the house in a correct way unless you have it on. Blew my mind.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I mean, there's some very basic pieces of this. So, you have an air conditioning, potentially you have a heating function, and then you potentially just have a fan setting. And so the fan is really what moves this air around the house. So you don't have to have it be cooling, you don't have to have it be heating, but you just need it to be going through the filter. Again, the basics of this is very straightforward, is that you can only clean the air if it goes through your filtration system. Now, if you open up all the windows in your home and you have the expectation that that outdoor air is coming in, that may be the case, but there are a lot of pressure dynamics, as you referred to, that are really hard to kind of generalize to different houses. So if you have a small house and you live somewhere on a hill where the wind goes through it, great. But if you live somewhere where you only have a couple of windows and they're small and you're not getting a lot of air movement around your house, you may not be getting all that much kind of air turnover in the house. If you really want to get specific about it, there are many commercially available air quality monitors that you can use. So I have one called Atmo. It basically tells me in real time what is the PM, what is the VOC in my house. You can kind of see what happens. What happens when you turn on a purifier? What happens when you open the windows? I think for most people, though, uh, it's good to imagine that you're generating the majority of the air pollution in your home. And so really the question would be, can you get enough clean air from outside? And for most people, I think if you have the HVAC, I'm totally with you. I would love not to use it at all. But if you're cooking and all these other things, I open the window and we run the fan at the same time, and we have an air purifier in the kitchen, and we have the ventilation for the stove. Just because these things are incredibly concentrated sources of air pollution. So it isn't as straightforward as just saying, "Oh, I've opened the window." If you really want to be on top of it, you need multiple shots on goal.
Yeah, I love that perspective because at the end of the day, if it's slipping past the goalie in your lungs, now you got all sorts of other issues that you're dealing with downstream. It's in your body. You're already starting to get inflamed. And so so we've talked about kind of reclaiming your providence around what you buy and what you bring into your house and reducing by opening windows and running filters and obviously getting the crap out of the house. Most of us right now are sitting here thinking, damn, I think I already have problems. There's guys out there selling $30,000 detox programs. And there's just so much hyperbole in terms of what the treatment modalities on this are. You've been testing people, you've been running through clinics for a long time. What moves the needle? How do we clean this up? How do we clean out the body and then stop the inputs?
I think really what you want run into is kind of the long-term pathway activation that comes from this. So it's metabolic dysfunction, it's immune dysfunction, it's brain dysfunction, it might be cardiovascular, specifically vascular dysfunction. And to all of these things, the strategies that we know are best suited for mitigating and reversing some of the damage tends to be the lifestyle factors that, you, Pedram, have been talking about for many years. It There are scenarios, right? So, for example, if you're being exposed to high levels of certain heavy metals, right? So, let's say you were just exposed to a lot of lead because you happen to live near a factory that was producing or doing work with lead, so you were inhaling it. Then there are certain forms of chelation that may make more sense for you. But by and large, for the average person, the issue, I believe, with air pollution is that you're chronically activating some of these pathways that we know, when chronically activated, lead to death and disability. And so you eventually get into this teeter totter kind of scenario where what you're doing can either be a vote for systemic inflammation, for metabolic dysfunction, or it can be a vote against it. And why that I think is really important is, you know, we could talk about NAD and mTOR activation. We could talk about, levels of omega 3s in the bloodstream. For most people, most of the time, it's going to be doing the basics well. That is the best strategy for mitigating and reversing many of these things. There is some data for things like B vitamins, omega 3s that may be helpful, but I think that, you know, this can be a challenging thing. And I'm a little hesitant to just recommend to the average person that they say, "Oh, I'm going to mitigate my air pollution exposure by taking mega doses of vitamin D." I think that that kind of skips over the reality of this, which is our body is a set of something like 39 trillion cells that are in constant interaction with each other, with the gut microbiome, with our environment. And I think you have to look at this holistic picture, which comes back to what you've already said, which is pay attention to your inputs and you'll be able to control your outputs. So while certain people, and I want to be clear here, there is a real threat if you're exposed to, let's say, a whole bunch of indoor mold, if you're exposed to certain heavy metals, if you have been exposed to very high levels of air pollution and may have immune activation in your body that would actually benefit from seeing a healthcare practitioner, to doing certain tests both in your home and in your body, to potentially chelating, to potentially using certain types of anti microbials to help reverse some of the damage that has been done. But everyone who's listening to this should be doing the following things. One, decreasing your exposure to air pollution. Two, taking steps to kind of reprogram the pathways that are activated by air pollution. What am I talking about? Primarily immune and metabolic. What are the things there? Well, again, these are the core things that are linked to better health. So sleep helps to flush out metabolic waste in the brain. It's something everyone should be involved in. Exercise, everyone is involved in sleep. I should say everyone should be paying attention more to and prioritizing. Um, Exercise, we know, activates a whole lot of amazing pathways that can help with kind of quelling chronic inflammation. Diet, I think I'm a big fan of the Mediterranean mind pattern diets. These actually may help to mitigate air pollution exposure. There are diets that are rich in real whole foods. And then beyond that, you can kind of go mechanistically into something like metabolic dysfunction and ask about various kind of dietary strategies. So for people who are metabolically unwell, I think these are people who can benefit ideally with the aid of a health practitioner from a diet that helps to improve insulin sensitivity, that helps to improve kind of fasting blood sugar levels, tends to be one that cuts out the refined carbohydrates, that helps to stabilize blood sugar. But I think at a high level, that's really where we need to be talking about this. So it's awareness, it's decreasing exposure, and then it's mitigating by way of all these lifestyle strategies.
And the detox pathways usually work. Now, if you don't have a bowel movement more than once a week or something, that's a different story. And I think, I think we both run into patients who are really backed up. And then you look at saying, okay, well, these detox pathways need some help. 2, 3 times a day is what the book says. 3 times a day is how the system is supposed to take out the trash, right? So drinking enough water, having enough bowel movements. But these are the basics to your point. The fundamentals, what you're alluding to here, I just want to be clear, is take away the signal and the alarm bell stops ringing. Live a good, clean, healthy lifestyle. Most of this will just sort out on its own without too much intervention at all.
I think that's true. And I think our bodies are incredibly intelligent and they do things they do for a good reason. And thinking about, what is it that links unhealthy food and air pollution, consumption of stressful media? What do all these things have in common? Well, they all increase inflammation in our bodies and in our brains. And the question would be why? And I realize the answer is because our body sees all of these different inputs as danger. Our bodies create inflammation because they're readying the troops because they perceive that there's a fight on the horizon. That is an adaptive response that makes a ton of sense because historically, we needed to be ready for danger. If we were experiencing stress chronically, if we were experiencing a whole lot of kind of unhealthy food, experiencing a whole lot of air pollution, it was telling our bodies we need to be ready to fight this off because it's throwing everything out of line. So, to your point, if we are decreasing the danger signal and decreasing the amount that those alarm bells are ringing, our body is going to go closer to a set of relative homeostasis and health. And I think this is where so many people can find so much benefit is simply don't program your body to tell it that there's danger on the horizon. So that is a generalized idea, which means decreasing your exposure to things that tell your body it's a dangerous world out there. It is in some ways, and for many people, a dangerous world out there. But, for example, there's a lot of crazy stuff going on in the news right now. It's real. We need to pay attention to it. We need to be informed. But there's a threshold effect after which you're basically just programming your brain to a set of relative danger signal. Similarly, when we look at food, obviously we need calories. Obviously, we need nutrients. But when we overdo it and take in too many specifically unhealthy calories, it stuffs our fat cells to the point where they're sending out danger signals that reach the brain because they're experiencing danger. They're experiencing a whole lot of distress. So I think air pollution is just another one of those things where when we look at the kind of sum total of the danger signals that our bodies are taking in, it's a really easy one that we can decrease. It may not always be as easy to decrease psychological stress or the stress that comes in through unhealthy diet, but all of us can do amazing things to decrease our air pollution exposure.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, if there's crime on the streets, it doesn't mean invite them into your living room, right? So the house is your sanctuary. Let's get it back for you so that when this signal comes down, you have more space for vitality and your life just gets better. Dr. Austin Perlmutter, always a pleasure. You're great. I really appreciate the work that you're doing. Where can people find you?
Yeah, a couple spots. My website is austinperlmutter.com. My social is Dr. Austin Perlmutter and or Dr. Austin Perlmutter on Instagram, I should say, where I'm primarily active, as well as I guess you could find me on YouTube. And then I'm doing work with a company called Big Bold Health, which